Thank you for joining me as I continue my examination of the book The Magic Man in the Sky by Carl Gallups. In this video, I'll be covering chapters 13 and 14 of the book. So let's get started right away with chapter 13, Proving the Existence of God, the Delivery. And now, the thrilling conclusion. When last we saw Carl Gallups, he was about to reveal these stunning, undeniable evidence that proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that this man, Kris Kringle, is the one and only Santa Claus. Sorry. The moment took me. I couldn't help myself. Anyway, he's going to prove that the God of the Bible is real. Those of you who are watching these as I upload them and who haven't read the book before have been waiting for a whole week to find out what this amazing evidence for God is. This undeniable evidence of God, which will be sort of the mantra of the chapter. Undeniable evidence of God. Undeniable evidence of God. Well, you're about to find out what that evidence is. But first, Gallups introduces the evidence, which he already spent the entire previous chapter of the book doing, but whatever, by sharing with us a verse from the book of Deuteronomy. And he quotes a longer passage from Deuteronomy. I'm only going to share with you what I feel is the most relevant part of that, which would be Deuteronomy chapter 4, verses 33 through 35, which reads like this, quote, "Did ever people hear the voice of God speaking out in the midst of the fire as thou hast heard and live? Or hath God essayed to go and take him a nation from the midst of another nation, by temptations, by signs, and by wonders, and by war, and by a mighty hand, and by a stretched out arm, and by great terrors, according to all that the Lord your God did for you in Egypt before your eyes? Unto thee it was showed, that thou mightest know that the Lord he is God. There is none else beside him." Well, just in case you didn't catch it, Gallups explains. There it is, God's proof of his existence. This declaration of divine evidence that he is the one and only God. This is also his proof that the Bible, which declares this truth, was the only book that had ever proclaimed such a certainty. His proof is the nation of Israel. Well, if any of you suddenly feel compelled to drop to your knees and recite the sinner's prayer, I will give you a moment. In fact, you can just take the moment to do whatever you might feel compelled to do in reaction to that evidence. Personally, I don't see how the existence of the nation of Israel is supposed to prove jack shit regarding the existence of God or the truth of the Bible, but Gallups certainly believes that it does. He goes on, quote, "Let me explain. Though this revelation may not appear so insightful right now, it will in a moment. The proof is undeniable. It will serve you well to thoroughly understand it." There's that word again, undeniable. As in, once you understand this evidence, you must accept the truth of Gallups' argument. To deny his claims after hearing this evidence would be irrational or intellectually dishonest or something. He explains this undeniable proof. See, in the book of Deuteronomy, before the Israelites reach the promised land, Moses predicts that God will both bless and curse Israel, and that Israel would rebel and would be driven from the promised land and scattered among many nations, but eventually would be gathered back together and return to the promised land. And guess what? Quote, "Israel did rebel. The nation was driven from the land, and as the passage predicted, Israel has now returned to the land from which it was driven. This fact makes the first declaration of Deuteronomy 4 all the more profound. I am afraid I cannot do proper justice to what you read in Deuteronomy 4. Well, that's to be expected by this point. Carl, you are a truly terrible writer. But in this case, it's not your fault. There's just not that much in Deuteronomy 4 to which to do proper justice in the first place, at least not in the intended sense. The proof that Gallups is offering us is basically this. The Bible predicts that some stuff would happen to Israel. The stuff actually happened. Therefore, the Bible is true and God exists. The obvious questions I, as a skeptic, have when presented this proof are, 1, did the stuff actually happen? And 2, if so, was it necessarily the work of God? We can argue over the answer to question one. I'm not a scholar or a historian. I don't know much more than the broad strokes of the history of the Jewish people. It seems to me, broadly speaking, that events like those predicted in Deuteronomy did happen. The Israelites were scattered. They were driven from what had been their home, but then they were brought back together and unified as a nation eventually. But that doesn't add up to undeniable proof of God. The opening section of the book of Deuteronomy, including chapter 4, was probably written at the end of the period known as the Babylonian captivity, when Jerusalem had been sacked and most of the Israelites in that region had been deported to Babylon. Now, the Babylonian captivity ended when the Babylonians were conquered by the Persians and the Israelites who had been exiled were allowed to return home. In other words, when Deuteronomy 4 was written, the expulsion from Israel, from the Promised Land had already occurred, and the return to the Promised Land was in the process of happening. Now, the Deuteronomist framed these events as a prophecy. He described them through the voice of Moses, supposedly predicting their occurrence in the far future from when Moses was supposedly writing all this. But they weren't future events to the actual author of these parts of Deuteronomy. They were current events. The expulsion from the Promised Land had happened. The return to the Promised Land was happening. So this was not prophecy. This was using prophetic language to describe something that was actually happening in real time at the time that this work was being composed. Now, how did Gallups miss this? Well, he didn't, actually. He refers to the Babylonian captivity in this chapter of the book, in fact. But he insists that Deuteronomy 4 refers not to that period of history, but to the dispersing of the Jews by the Romans in the 1st and 2nd century AD, and then to the founding of the modern state of Israel after World War II. He says, quote, "Remember, the words of Deuteronomy were given long before these events happened." And by these events, he means not only the expulsion from Palestine by the Romans and then eventually the founding of the State of Israel, but also the Babylonian captivity. He believes that Deuteronomy was written before the Babylonian captivity, not during the Babylonian captivity, because he believes that Moses actually wrote the book of Deuteronomy. Well, Moses didn't write the book of Deuteronomy. Moses probably never even actually existed. But the first 5 books of the Old Testament claim to be the work of Moses. They are traditionally attributed to Moses, and that's good enough for Carl Gallups' centuries of biblical criticism and historical research be damned. By the way, Gallups doesn't accept that the end of the Babylonian captivity is the fulfillment of that prophecy in Deuteronomy 4, because at the end of the Babylonian captivity, when the Israelites returned to what they called the Promised Land, they were still not able to govern themselves. Now, I don't see why this is important. Deuteronomy 4, as I read it, doesn't specify that the Israelites will become an independent nation. It just says that they will return to the Promised Land. But, whatever. I don't think Gallups' interpretation of the passage makes sense, given what we know about the writing of Deuteronomy. But let's give Gallups the benefit of the doubt, and let's assume that his interpretation of Deuteronomy is accurate, that Deuteronomy 4 is not the work of an Israelite in the 6th century BC hoping to inspire his people by framing their present return to Jerusalem following a long exile as a sign of God's mercy and steadfastness, but rather the much older work of Moses himself prophesying events that won't actually happen for many, many centuries. Even with that assumption, can we say that the expulsion of the Jews from Palestine by the Romans and the founding of the State of Israel nearly 2 millennia later were the fulfillment of that prophecy, of that promise of God in Deuteronomy 4? Well, it's certainly possible to look at it that way. But it's also possible to view those events, which, again, were separated by almost 2,000 years, the expulsion by the Romans and the founding of the State of Israel, as resulting from the politics of their times, with no divine intervention evident or needed to explain why these events are happening. I regard prophecies much as I do miracles. If you can't show me the difference between a prophecy being apparently fulfilled as a result of coincidence and a prophecy actually being fulfilled due to the work of God, then I don't see how the concept has any real value. And if the choice is between the founding of the State of Israel being a fulfillment of an ancient biblical prophecy or being the result of contemporary political and social movements that just so happens to roughly match the outline of an ancient biblical prophecy, I'll rely on the sharpness of Occam's razor and go with the latter. Was the scattering of the Jews and the eventual creation of the State of Israel necessarily the work of God? Even if we interpret Deuteronomy 4 the same way Gallups does, I think the answer is no. It is not necessarily the work of God. And with that, Gallups' much ballyhooed undeniable proof of God is reduced to more empty posturing. He literally has nothing. Gallups, needless to say, doesn't see it this way. He says, quote, "This is the certain evidence for which the unbelieving world has been asking. It is also the evidence for which the Christian community has been wishing. Yet it has been present all along, and the Lord himself declared it would be so." Well, but it hasn't been present all along, has it? This brings up a pretty major hole in Gallups' undeniable proof. The State of Israel, the fulfillment of this prophecy, the supposed undeniable proof of the truth of the Bible and the existence of God, wasn't founded until 1948. If it is the evidence of his existence God promises in the Old Testament, what were the people who didn't live to see it happen supposed to do? What would happen if Carl Gallups had been asked by a skeptic who demanded evidence of God in, say, the 19th century? What would he have said then? Oh, just wait. One of these days, Israel is going to be reconstituted as a nation, and then you'll see? He would have had nothing to point to if the State of Israel is his slam dunk proof. If the State of Israel is God's promised undeniable evidence of his existence, it is, at least in character, that it was such a long time coming. Remember, this is the same God who watched for thousands of years as presumably every single person who ever died went to hell before deciding to do something about it in the person of Jesus. Half-assed, extremely belated solutions to problems of his own making are among the Christian God's most recognizable hallmarks. Well, that's it for chapter 13. I'm sorry if you were disappointed in the lackluster nature of the undeniable proof. As is so often the problem with so many projects these days, Gallups is really good at the hype, but really, really poor at the follow-through, at the delivery. It's disappointing, but sadly typical. Anyway, let's move on now to chapter 14 of the book, which is titled, "Is That Your Final Answer?" Gallups turns from the undeniable evidence for the God of the Bible to take another series of weak, poorly aimed shots at the theory of evolution. The existence of God and the truth of the Bible, as interpreted by Gallups, having been definitively proven in the previous chapter, this would seem to be a redundant waste of effort. But what the hell do I know? I mean, you've already definitively proven the existence of God beyond all possible objections, so why are you still having such a hard-on for the theory of evolution? What does it matter? You've proven the existence of God. Nobody can possibly disagree with you now. Yeah, but fuck evolution. Seriously, that shit pisses me off. Okay, Carl. Go ahead. Go get it out of your system, buddy. Just get it out of your system. Evolution, Gallups declares, is the result of humans trying to answer the big questions. These are the big philosophical questions, like why are we here? Where do we come from? What's the meaning of life? And evolution is what happens, Gallups says, when man tries to answer those questions without turning to God. And we come up with bleak, hopeless, pseudoscientific, and fatalistic answers, like the theory of evolution. Gallups describes three possibilities for how we came to be. We have always existed, we exist as the result of an intelligent designer, or we exist as the result of what he calls cosmic happenstance. He says, quote, "Therefore, if evolution is the answer to life's questions, then in reality, we are left with more remarkably complex and at times perplexing questions. Evolutionists propose that man is here without the input of an intelligent designer, and they insist there is no reasoned purpose for our presence. We exist simply because of a random, accidental information exchange. On a regular basis, the evolutionist community uses words like processes, engaging, purpose, and information, yet these and other terms, by definition, require intelligence behind them when the words are used in their traditional and purest sense. Evolution is not the answer to life's questions. Evolution is the process responsible for the diversity of life. It is a scientific answer to a scientific question. And by the way, when Gallups mentions that if evolution is the answer to life's questions, then we're left with remarkably more complex and perplexing questions. If that's true, that doesn't mean that evolution is false. Finding out the true answer to something doesn't always resolve all possible further questions. It doesn't completely satisfy you. You can learn the truth about something and discover that it is much more complex and mysterious and confusing than you thought it would be. That's okay. That doesn't mean the answer you found is wrong. Just saying. The facts of evolution do place certain limitations on what the answers to those big questions can be. But the occurrence of evolution and the fact that all life on Earth is related through common descent and the product of natural rather than divinely directed forces don't force us to view our existence as hopeless or meaningless or without purpose. Evolution doesn't mean philosophy no longer has a role to play in answering questions like where do we come from or why are we here. Evolution doesn't mean that religion no longer has a role to play in answering those questions. Evolution doesn't rule out the existence of gods or even Christianity. It does mean that the particular version of Christianity preached by Carl Gallups can't be entirely true, but that's a testament to the vanity of Gallups, that he sees no possibility for a meaningful existence outside of his own narrow interpretation of a single religion. As for the second half of that quote, it's true that sometimes scientists use familiar terms in different senses than we use them in everyday conversation. When an evolutionary biologist refers to how a given organism is designed or to the purpose of a particular trait, the biologist is describing things like structure and function, but is not meaning to imply that these things are the results of intelligence. The fact that design implies a designer in everyday speech doesn't mean the implication holds in a scientific context. Scientists do the best they can to describe often very complex things using language that can easily be understood by not only their fellow scientists, but also by laypersons like me. And our language, as magnificent as it is, does have its limitations. Gallups objects to the distinction that is often made between abiogenesis and evolution. He calls this distinction hogwash, italicized with an exclamation point at the end of it, arguing that the origin of life and the evolution of life are inextricably linked, which no one disputes. The reason those of us who accept evolution insist on pointing out that abiogenesis and evolution are separate fields is that apologists and creationists will often begin talking about evolution and then change the subject to abiogenesis. Evolution is the study of the descent and diversification of life, and evolution by common descent is a fact, regardless of how life originated. The details of abiogenesis are unsettled, though the fact that it occurred somehow would seem to be self-evident. But regardless of what those details are, evolution is an observed fact. It is the process responsible for the diversity of life we observe today. Appeals to incredulity regarding abiogenesis can't change that and are in fact irrelevant to that conversation. Maybe Gallups is confused about how scientists regard the relationship between abiogenesis and evolution because he has no idea what the fuck either abiogenesis or evolution actually have to say about where life came from or how it came to its present state of being. Get a load of how Gallups summarizes what he calls origins theory. Quote, succinctly stated, the theory of origins insists that all of life arose from a singular source, a common ancestor. This source of life started as the simplest life form possible, and as a non-living substance, or a conglomeration of non-living substances, abiogenesis, chemosynthesis. Once this single-celled form of life began more than 600 million observed years ago, it became a multicelled organism. Evolutionists claim that among the most primitive of the multicelled organisms was the sponge. Well, the sponge being, or a sponge-like organism being the multicellular ancestor of all modern animals, is only one of several possibilities. It's not universally accepted that the sponges were the earliest or the most primitive animals, but that is one possibility. Anyway, Gallups goes on describing how sponges begat worms, and worms begat fish, which begat amphibians, and so on, all the way down the line until finally humans appeared. All of this, by the way, he continues to describe as origins theory, which he then indignantly accuses of requiring evolution to work, thus proving that abiogenesis and evolution are the same thing. A few things. First, as I said already, no one who knows what he or she is talking about is saying that abiogenesis and evolution are totally unrelated. The distinction is made in conversations with creationists because they either don't understand or don't care about the differences between the two fields and why they are considered separate but related areas of study. Second, no biologist would describe most of what Gallups says in this section as origins theory, which Gallups equates with abiogenesis. The development of multicellular life, sponges, worms, etc., is evolution, and would be called such by anyone who knew what they were talking about. Gallups is using his own confusion of the terms to accuse scientists of misleading people, which is among the dumber things he's done so far in this rather dumb book. Third, either Gallups really, and I mean really, doesn't know shit about evolution, or he's an incompetent writer. Now, both of these things are true, generally speaking, but they needn't both be true in this particular instance that I'm going to discuss. The sentence, once this single-celled life form began more than 600 million unobserved years ago, it became a multicelled organism, is factually incorrect no matter how you try to account for it. The earliest forms of life appeared on Earth around 4 billion years ago. But I'm not sure if Carl Gallups thinks single-celled life first appeared 600 million years ago, or if he just misplaced a comma. Because check this out, that sentence with the comma after ago is wrong. Once this single-celled life form began more than 600 million unobserved years ago, it became a multicelled organism. Wrong. But this sentence, which is the same sentence, just with the comma moved to follow the word began, is more or less accurate, if awkwardly constructed. Once this single-celled life form began, more than 600 million unobserved years ago, it became a multicelled organism. So, scientific ignorance or shitty writing. You be the judge. Gallups spends much of the rest of the chapter ranting about the imagined attempts by scientists to claim that evolution has nothing at all to do with abiogenesis, comparing it to a quantum scientist who is only interested in studying quantum effects in the here and now and not how they worked from the beginning. Whatever the fuck that means. Quantum physics, like the classical laws of physics, have presumably worked the same from the beginning, or at least since the present conditions of the universe have existed. And I'm under the impression that most quantum physicists do primarily concern themselves with how quantum physics works in the here and now. Also, accusing an evolutionary biologist of hypocrisy for pointing out that abiogenesis is a separate field of study is a bit like accusing a nuclear physicist of hypocrisy for not wanting to suddenly start talking about the Big Bang. Science is divided into fields, and scientists have specialties to better focus their efforts, just as, well, where'd all these atoms even come from anyway, would not be a relevant question in a debate about the validity of nuclear physics. Well, where'd the first organisms come from is not a relevant question when debating the validity of evolutionary biology. Finally, Gallups returns to the big questions he considered at the start of the chapter before going off on his deranged tangent about evolution and abiogenesis. Evolution, he says, can't give satisfying answers to those big questions. Quote, in the evolutionists' fatalistic scenario of how life originated and then progresses, nothing must follow this life. We are born, we live, we die, and then we cease. All we have between birth and death is a world full of seeming inconsistencies. We may experience a bit of joy and pleasure, but we will also have pain, death, disease, war, heartache, injustice, and inhumanity. Without a supreme reason, we have no supreme purpose to life, and we have no real answers to the deepest problems of life. Life becomes relegated to the survival of the fittest, and nothing more. Well, just as evolution doesn't address the origin of life, it also has nothing to say about the existence or non-existence of an afterlife. It simply isn't a question that falls within the purview of evolutionary biology. Now, many people who accept evolution also happen to be atheists or non-religious in some way. They also happen to not believe in gods and to not believe in an afterlife. That's a very common belief, but it is not imposed upon us by evolution. There are many of us who believe that it is a reasonable implication of evolution, that it follows very rationally from the study of evolution and the study of the natural sciences in general, but it is not required that you believe that. You can be religious and accept evolution. You can believe in an afterlife and accept evolution. Evolution does not force you to have any particular beliefs in any of those areas. It is not concerned with those areas. As for the rest of that quote, I'll briefly reiterate something that I've said when this complaint has been raised by apologists I've considered in the past, as it often has been. Lack of supreme purpose doesn't mean lack of purpose. Lack of supreme morality, which Gallups laments in the next paragraph, doesn't equal lack of morality. Moral principles may be human constructs, but that doesn't make them imaginary. The purposes of our lives may come from ourselves, from our interests, our passions, our goals, our thoughts and feelings and actions, but that doesn't make them meaningless. Furthermore, I would argue that the fact that these things come not from some divine bestower of purposes or giver of moral laws, but from ourselves, is the very thing that gives them meaning. And survival of the fittest is one way of describing how part of evolution works. The theory of evolution doesn't impose this as the only possible meaning of life. Evolution is descriptive, not prescriptive. It tells us how things work, not how things should work, not how we should organize our society, not how we should perceive life and our existence and these philosophical questions that vex us. It doesn't have anything to say about any of that. Its purpose, as with all other branches of science, is to allow us to discover what is true. Not what we would like to be true, and not how we feel or what we think about that truth. Gallups declares that there is no evidence to establish the fact of evolution, and, quote, in spite of our desperate and fascinating attempts to find other intelligent life anywhere else in our universe, we have discovered none to date. We have not even discovered a verified microbe. What are the reasonable odds of that if evolution were a scientific fact? Would not this astonishing process of evolution have occurred on at least one other planet somewhere, anywhere in the known universe? A reasonable mind would answer yes. The evolutionists' all-powerful magical force in the mud is not so formidable after all. Gallups is confusing two different questions, which isn't surprising given how he's conducted himself throughout the book. Have we discovered extraterrestrial life? Have we actually discovered it? No. But does extraterrestrial life exist somewhere in the universe? Well, that's a different question. The only answer we can give to that question with certainty at this point is we don't know. Because we haven't looked everywhere and found that it doesn't exist, and we haven't found it anywhere, so the only certain answer is that we don't know, that we're not certain. But given how vast the universe is, how commonplace planets not unlike our own seem to be, and how abundant and easily manufactured the basic building blocks of life as we know it are, it seems plausible, even probable, that life does exist somewhere other than our planet, somewhere in the universe, perhaps many somewheres in our universe. Gallups emphasizes that extraterrestrial life has never been discovered, as though that is a point in his favor. And you know what? I'm willing to give him that point, because I feel very confident that I'm getting it back eventually. The two most important words in that passage I just quoted were these: to date. We have discovered no other life in the universe to date. What we have discovered is that there is nothing unique or special about our planet, our sun, our solar system, our galaxy, and our place within it, or the stuff of which we and all those other objects I just mentioned are made. We've not found life yet, but the more we look and the more we learn, the more likely it seems that it's out there somewhere. No other argument Gallups has yet made is as clearly and unmistakably stamped with an expiration date as this one. And no other argument illustrates so clearly how heavily he must lean on ignorance and conceit to hold his position. Well, that's it for chapter 14. That's it for the material we're going to cover in this video. In the next video, I will be back to cover the next 3 chapters of the book. Those will be chapter 15, The Meaning of Life, chapter 16, The Problem of Evil, and chapter 17, Is Evolution Settled Science? Which, if he were to answer that question honestly, would be the shortest chapter in the book. It would be a one-word chapter, but something tells me it ain't going to be a one-word chapter. Anyway, that's it for this video. Thank you guys so much for watching. Please leave a comment on this video. Tell me where I got something wrong. Tell me where I got something right. Tell me I did a horrible job. Tell me I did a really great job, if you think so. I always appreciate reading the comments. I'm so glad that you guys watch this and find this of use, find this of interest, and I will see you in the next video.